Welcome to Poetry.LA.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to talk about a new project that you're doing. You're a poet and you have a day job as a journalist.
That's right.
And you've combined these two worlds to create this really interesting project called Poets on the Beat.
That's right.
You are a senior reporter with Capital in Maine, is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about Capital in Maine.
Capital in Maine is a nonprofit newsroom in Los Angeles that covers economic and environmental issues. And we have a particular focus on climate and inequality. And the reason that we focus on these issues is because these are two of the biggest challenges that are facing us right now as we see it. And so, you know, what that means is you'll read stories in our publication about the housing crisis, about the unhoused. You'll read stories about the influence of the oil and gas industry on policy. And we write a lot of California stories, but we also cover stories in states across the country.
And now you have developed this new project called Poets on the Beat in conjunction with Beyond Baroque Literary Arts Center. And it involves a number of California poets. So tell us how this project got started.
The origin for this idea goes back to 2020, sort of on the eve of the presidential election. I was asked to, because as you said, I'm a poet, I was asked to write a poem right before the election, about the election. And I said, no, I can't do that.
Was this for Capital in Maine?
For Capital in Maine, yeah.
Okay.
I was asked by the publisher, can you turn something around? Well, you know, as a poet, it's not always so easy to turn on a dime. And you know, this was an historic election, and a lot of people were on edge. And I said, I can't do that, but you know what, I'll do something else. I'll write this little essay, and it was called Verse for a Bruised Country. And you know, it quoted Langston Hughes and Thomas Lux and you know, a bunch of different poets, and sort of kind of offered these poems as sort of something for people to contemplate as they headed into this very nerve-wracking election.
What kind of reaction did your audience have to the article?
We were very pleased because it was picked up in the Los Angeles Times newsletter, and you know, somewhat surprised. I think it was something that you know was unusual, that they hadn't seen. I think this form of talking about current events and poetry at the same time is sort of unusual. And so I thought, you know, this is something, you know, this has sort of been, it was in my mind that maybe this was something that we could do more with in the future. And then this, you know, about a year ago, I proposed that we do something a little bit more ambitious and really enlist some very distinguished poets to write essays on you know, political issues, on you know, on social issues that that we're facing, and poetry, at the interplay between these two.
How did you choose which poets to include?
This project is a collaboration between Capital in Maine and Beyond Baroque Literary Arts Center. So I spend most of my time in the world of journalism, and I wanted to work with Beyond Baroque to select, you know, a group of poets who we thought could speak to contemporary issues. Of course, there's so many who could, you know, so I think we picked, I think, some really fine poets and writers to do this series.
And how did you work with them to choose the topics?
I had some ideas about the types of subjects that we would want to cover, and I spoke with Quentin Ring at Beyond Baroque about, you know, who are some poets who would be good for who could address these these themes, and he's very obviously familiar with the you know, the poets you know, who are writing in Los Angeles.
Who are some of the poets that you've got in the series of Poets on the Beat?
There are 6 poets. They are Luis Rodriguez, Suzanne Lummis, Lynn Thompson, Seshu Foster, Shonda Buchanan, and Lee Herrick. We launched the series with Luis Rodriguez, who is a former LA Poet Laureate and memoirist that many people are familiar with his work. So what we asked the poets to do was to select one of their poems that really connected to the theme of the essay. And in some cases, the poets themselves talk about their own poems in the essays. So, for example, Shonda Buchanan she's working on a collection right now of poetry that responds to the Black Lives Matter movement. So her essay includes a long passage from Richard Wright's Between the World and Me, which is a searing poem that is about a man who comes across the aftermath of a lynching.
Oh,
yeah. And because people think of that title and they think of the Ta-Nehisi Coates book, you know, but and then she also writes a poem. I mean, she also includes her poem, Return the White Breath to the Black Body, which is a poem that she wrote after much struggle to respond to the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think one thing that she wants to say in that piece is that there's the long history of writers, of Black writers, you know, going back to Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved woman, you know, writing about these issues. This is not something new.
I've read that essay and watched her reading that poem, and it's, her poem, it repeats the concept return, return, return. It's a very dramatic poem.
Return the white breath to its black body. Return the bullet to its gun. Return the gun to its holster. Return the hand to its side. Return the officer to his car.
I highly recommend that people listen to Shonda read that poem because, as you mentioned, I think there's her use of repetition, return, I think it's like return the officer to his car, return the car to its garage, return, return.
Yes.
And it's a kind of obsessive repetition. It's very, you know, incredibly moving, distressing, as, you know, as it should be. And she reads it really beautifully. But I think it shows kind of what poetry can do, you know, it's different.
What aspects of current events did you think that the poets would write about that were different, or that might be different from journalists?
News, you know, at its, you know, can deliver information. It can, you know, it can tell stories sometimes that move us. But poetry has an access to a whole range of other tricks and techniques, right? You have the poet's voice. You have a certain, you know, they can use things like repetition or you know, assonance or other things, and that's a musicality, right? That gives you access to emotion, right? That prose doesn't have.
But going to the content. Would you say that the idea was to bring a poet's perspective to opinion journalism? And how does a poet's perspective differ from a journalist's perspective?
Sometimes poets can come at things a little bit slant, you know, and they can, I mean, you know, take Luis's piece, for example, which, as I said, is kind of part memoir and also a little bit of a history of the labor movement, but through his own story. And then he also has his poetry kind of interwoven into that piece. And then he, you know, there's a lot in there, and then he's also reading it. I think one thing, you know, he talks in his essay about being the child of immigrant workers. His mother labored over a sewing machine and was up late at night doing piecework. And he was, you know, he resented the fact that he didn't, in some ways, have more time with her, that her energy was consumed by this work. And so I think he's giving, and I think it's through his language, which is really beautiful in that piece. You know, he's giving this kind of child's eye view.
It erupted into our lives. Two guys in jeans shoved it through the door, heaving and grunting and biting lower lips. A large industrial sewing machine. We called it the monster.
This has been called the hot labor summer. There we have hotel workers in the street. We have, you know, Hollywood actors and writers in the street. And so I think this is something, you know, really different. This is a really different way to think about labor and work.
Yeah,
and he has a very distinctive voice in the way he talks about it, and so much authority, because he was also a factory worker. The piece talks about his evolution from factory worker to poet.
One of the other poets in the series is Lynn Thompson, who's was the LA Poet Laureate, as was Luis Rodriguez.
Snow geese in Butte. If you find a living snow goose, contact Montana Standard, 2016. In the Treasure State, snow geese are no longer flying.
And I want to read you a line from her essay. She says, "Even as poets grieve, we affirm our connection with the world." Why is this perspective of grief and connection important?
I think for me personally, one of the inspirations for doing this is that as part of my job, I'm kind of inundated with the news all day long. And I think it actually can perhaps sometimes feed a sense of disconnection and not connection. And I think when we read poetry and we think about poetry, it's not just reading poetry, but thinking about poetry, thinking about other people, reading other people, the way other people think about poetry. And thinking about poetry, by the way, is thinking about life and how to be in the world, in my view. And how to be in this world where we have all these existential challenges, right? That's what we're asking these poets to do. We're asking these poets to do a lot of things, by the way. I think actually really reaffirms that sense of connection. And so when you take something like climate change, you know, you can read a lot of stories about the threats that we're facing. You can read the reports. But I think the connection, I think this reaffirming of connection is really important and really fundamental.
Seshu Foster is one of the poets that I really enjoy his work. He's just got a fabulous mind. And he writes about housing, and in particular, the home that Bertolt Brecht lived in Santa Monica, which has been preserved as a historic home. And he writes about the family home that Angel Dominguez lived in with his family, which has been torn down and replaced with an apartment building. And my sense from reading the essay was that he had captured a huge aspect of the housing industry that we hardly look at. What's to be saved? What's to be torn down? How do we accommodate more people? These were
two poets writing at very different times who had a sense, who were exiled from their you know, coming from Angel Dominguez coming from Mexico, Bertolt Brecht from Germany, you know, during the war, and finding homes in Los Angeles, and then even in Los Angeles sort of having this sense of rootlessness, which I think in a way is connected to this commodified housing market, and also this you know, and Seshu would say to inequality as well. And so it's just interesting that to lift up Brecht, you know, who was writing in the 40s, in some ways touching on some of the themes that we experience now, which is, you know, people living in these, you know, luxurious homes and other people struggling. In this famous poem he writes about Los Angeles, which he says looks, you know, a lot like hell, because, you know,
even more than London.
You know, homes that are empty even when lived in. Mm-hmm. And then Angel Dominguez, who, as you say, you know, has the grandmother's home in the San Fernando Valley is razed, and he feels sort of twice exiled, having lost his ancestral home in Mexico, and then, you know, again in LA. So I think, I mean, those were he took it in a very surprising place. You know, that's not something you're going to read about
right.
in the news, and yet I do feel this search for home and people's wanting to feel at home is such a profound human need, and we have such struggle in the public sphere about this question.
How do people find this series, Poets on the Beat?
You can go to www.capitalandmain.com and come to Capital and Main's site and find it. If you Google maybe one of the poets' names whose piece has already come out, like Luis Rodriguez, and Poets on the Beat, it'll come up in search, because sometimes people like to find things that way, or at least I do.
Great.
When you don't want to type in the whole address.
Are there other related events or activities that we should let people know about?
I am so glad you asked. Beyond Baroque is hosting a panel on Poets on the Beat on October 12th. It will be a discussion about the project. There'll be readings of poems, and then, and some multimedia elements too.
So tell me about the future of Poets on the Beat.
Poets on the Beat will be up on the Capital and Main site in perpetuity, and people will be able to read the essays, hear the poets, read their work, and you know, just enjoy you know, I hope they have fun with it. I hope this will give them a new way to look at poetry and to hear poetry and think about some of the challenges we're facing right now.